Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
And today we're doing things a little differently, taking a deep dive into the history of economics,
We're going to be jumping into excerpts from Luxakin to Huck.
which translates to a brief history of economics.
That's right.
And I know.
Sometimes economics can seem a little, well, dry, like textbooky.
Yeah,
But trust me on this.
this is anything but.
Oh, absolutely. We're going to uncover some fascinating stories along the way.
Yeah, we're talking aha moments,
The surprising connections that shaped how we think about money.
markets, the whole shebang.
We're going to give you a framework, a way to understand how economic thinking has evolved and why it matters to you, like today.
Okay, so ancient Greece. It's kind of a natural starting point, right?
Like, the philosophers back then, they were tackling all the big questions.
It's true.
But it's wild to think that even the word economics, like the word itself,
Has its roots way back in ancient Greece.
yeah, economics, it comes from the Greek word economicus. And that was all about how households manage their resources.
It's like tracing the family tree of economics all the way back to, like, these ancient Greek households.
And speaking of influential figures, our book here starts with a philosophical power duo, right? Plato and Aristotle.
And I don't know about you, but when I think about Plato and Aristotle, I'm thinking philosophy, not exactly like Wall Street.
Yeah.
So what makes them so important in the history of, like, economic thought?
Well, their world was very different from ours, but they were grappling with questions that are still incredibly relevant today.
What makes a fair society? What role should the state play?
Okay.
How do we distribute resources? I mean, these are questions that are still debated centuries later.
Timeless questions. So how did they, like, approach these issues?
Well, Plato, he had this idea of the ideal republic.
And it was a society led by, get this, philosopher kings.
Philosopher
Kings. He really believed that these enlightened rulers would prioritize the common good and make sure that everyone had a role to play.
Okay.
And it was very idealistic, right? It was about harmony, social order.
Like a perfectly orchestrated society.
Exactly. But then you have Aristotle. Now, he was Plato's student.
But he had a bit of a different take.
Aristotle was much more interested in the practicality of exchange, how individuals interacted in markets, the function of money.
Well-
Remember, this was a time when trade was expanding, coinage was becoming more common,
Right.
and those practical considerations really fascinated him.
Which is where we get that story about the Spartan ruler, right?
And the one who used those heavy iron bars as currency.
Oh, yeah.
And I remember reading that and thinking, like, wow, talk about discouraging people from hoarding wealth.
It's a great example. While other city-states were embracing trade, accumulating wealth, Sparta went in a totally different direction.
They thought wealth led to corruption, inequality. So they used these cumbersome iron bars to make it really hard to amass a lot of wealth.
It's like the ultimate anti-materialism statement. But did it work? Like, did it actually shape Spartan society the way they intended?
That's a great question. And honestly, it's up for debate.
Hmm.
I mean, we know the Spartans. They were known for their military, that austere lifestyle.
Right.
But it's really hard to say for sure if it was directly because of their choice of currency or other factors.
It's never just about the money.
Right. It's a classic example of how economic decisions are always intertwined with social and political values.
That's so interesting. And it makes me think, how much did these ancient Greek ideas, how much did they really influence, like, the actual course of economic history?
Were people still thinking about Plato and Aristotle
Yeah.
centuries later?
It's interesting you ask that because our book actually makes a pretty big jump after the ancient Greeks.
Oh.
We fast forward all the way to the Middle Ages and we land right on Thomas Aquinas.
Now, that's not a name I would have expected on our economic history tour.
I mean, he's known for his theological writings, not exactly market analysis. So, like, what was Aquinas's perspective on money and economics?
Well, to understand Aquinas' view, you really have to understand the context he was living in.
Okay.
Europe in the Middle Ages, very different place.
The Roman Empire had fallen, feudalism was the dominant social order, trade had declined,
Right.
and the Catholic Church, it held immense influence.
So not exactly a bustling marketplace of ideas.
You got it.
But even in this context, questions about wealth, poverty, and the morality of economic activity, those questions were very much alive. And Aquinas, being one of the most influential theologians of his time, he grappled with these questions head on.
Okay, so set the scene for us. What were some of the big economic debates happening during Aquinas' time?
One of the hottest topics was the morality of charging interest on loans.
Okay.
We call it usury today.
But back then, lending money at interest was often seen as sinful, exploitative, even condemned by the church.
Wow. It's hard to imagine a time when interest was considered morally wrong.
It's such a fundamental part of our financial system today.
Exactly. It's what makes this so fascinating. It challenges our assumptions about how things have always been.
Right. Okay, so how did Aquinas weigh in on this whole debate about interest?
Aquinas, he drew on ancient Greek philosophy, Christian teachings,
Hmm.
and he argued that money itself wasn't inherently good or bad.
Okay.
He saw it primarily as a medium of exchange, a tool to facilitate trade.
So no problem with money itself, but what about charging interest?
That's where things get interesting. Aquinas believed that charging excessive interest, especially when you're lending to those in need, that was morally wrong.
He saw that as taking advantage of someone's misfortune, which went against the Christian principles of charity and compassion.
So there was a moral dimension to lending money back then, a sense of responsibility. Like, it went beyond just making a profit.
Absolutely. Now, it's really important to remember that Aquinas' views were shaped by the specific context of the Middle Ages.
Sure.
But his ideas, especially those concerns about economic activity becoming exploitative or unjust, they still resonate today.
It's fascinating. I think we often think about economics as this, like cold, hard science, all numbers and graphs.
But hearing you talk about it, it's clear that from the very beginning, it's always been intertwined with these deeper ethical and philosophical questions.
Okay, so we've gone from ancient Greece to the Middle Ages, encountered some honestly surprising figures along the way.
Where does our deep dive take us next?
Well, buckle up, because we are about to enter a period of huge change, a lot of upheaval.
We're moving from the medieval world into the Renaissance,
Okay.
a time of intellectual ferment, exploration, and of course, the rise of nation-states.
I'm sensing some major shifts in economic thought on the horizon.
Oh yeah.
What should we be paying attention to as we enter this new era?
So we're on the cusp of the Renaissance, the world is about to get a whole lot bigger. What's changing in the realm of economics?
Well, this is where we see the rise of mercantilism.
Okay.
So imagine this. European powers are expanding their reach, exploring new lands, establishing these trade routes that span the globe.
Yeah.
There's this intense competition, right?
Yeah.
For resources, for wealth, for dominance, like on a global scale.
Okay, I can see where this is going. Nations trying to get ahead, amass wealth. Sounds kind of familiar.
Exactly.
And mercantilism, it really becomes the dominant economic doctrine of this era.
Okay.
It's all about nation states accumulating wealth, primarily in the form of gold and silver.
So it's like bigger coffers, bigger armies, bigger empires.
Exactly. Think of it as this giant competition to hoard the most treasure.
Okay. But if everyone's so focused on just hoarding gold, doesn't that create its own problems?
You're absolutely right. And this brings us to a fascinating figure from our book, Francis Drake.
Hold on, Francis Drake.
The explorer, the one who was knighted by Queen Elizabeth I. What does he have to do with economics?
Drake's story, it really embodies this era of mercantilism.
Okay.
Remember, he was essentially a state-sanctioned pirate.
Raiding Spanish ships laden with gold and silver from the Americas.
Right.
His exploits, they brought immense wealth back to England, contributing directly to their growing power.
Okay, that's a history lesson I was not expecting.
So Drake, the poster child for mercantilism.
But I'm guessing it wasn't all, smooth sailing, right, for this theory.
You're right. Mercantilism had its critics, and it had its flaws.
Remember that analogy of nations hoarding treasure?
Yeah, it's going out of style.
Well, some economists started to point out that simply amassing gold and silver, it wasn't enough. Yeah. They argued that true wealth, it came from a nation's productive capacity, from what it could actually produce and trade.
So it's not enough to just sit on a pile of gold. You have to actually make something of it.
Precisely.
Yeah.
You can't eat gold for dinner, right?
Right.
And this critique of mercantilism, it starts to pave the way for new economic thinking, for ideas that will eventually lay the foundation for capitalism.
Okay, here's where it gets really exciting. We're finally entering the territory of those big names we all associate with economics, right?
Adam Smith, Karl Marx, that whole crew.
Yeah.
Where do we even begin?
I know. Our book throws a lot of names at us in this section. It's like a who's who of economic thought. But I think it's helpful to think about it as different schools of thought emerging, each offering a unique perspective on this rapidly changing world.
Okay, so break it down for us. What are the big ideas that are like taking center stage?
Well, first we have the physiocrats,
Okay.
with figures like Quesnay arguing that land, not gold, was the true source of wealth.
Right.
They believed that agriculture, the productivity of the land, that was the backbone of a strong economy.
So it's like a shift away from that mercantilist um, obsession with precious metals.
Exactly.
And the physiocrats, they were also big proponents of laissez-faire economics, minimal government intervention.
Okay.
They believed that the market, kind of like nature itself, it had this natural order, and that interference from the government would just disrupt that harmony.
So the government should just, like, back off and let the market do its thing. Sounds familiar.
Right.
It's amazing to see how these early ideas still resonate today.
They do. And then, of course, comes the big one, Adam Smith, often considered like the father of modern economics.
This is the guy who gave us the invisible hand, right?
One of those economic concepts you hear everywhere, but like no one can really explain.
That's the one. Smith argued that individuals acting in their own self-interest could actually lead to a more prosperous society as a whole.
Oh.
It's as if there's this invisible hand guiding them, right, towards a collective good, even if they're not consciously trying to achieve it.
Okay, so like unpack that a little bit. How does this invisible hand actually work? Like, give us an example.
Imagine a baker making bread, right? Okay. He's not primarily motivated by some altruistic desire to, like, feed his community.
Right.
He's trying to make a living, to earn a profit.
Right.
But by pursuing that self-interest, by baking delicious bread that people want to buy, he's also unintentionally meeting the needs of his community.
I get it. The baker makes a living, people get their bread. It's a win-win. So this self-interest, it's like guided by the invisible hand of the market, ends up benefiting everyone.
That's the theory. Now, Smith wasn't arguing that people should be completely selfish, right?
He believed that morality and empathy were still essential. But he also saw the power of self-interest when it was channeled through the market to create economic growth, to improve people's lives.
It's such a radical idea. Like,
Yeah.
our individual desires could actually fuel a more prosperous society.
It was a radical departure from previous thinking. Now, Smith had a lot more to say about free markets, competition, the division of labor. Remember his famous example of the pin factory.
Right.
But that idea, the invisible hand, it remains one of his most enduring and hotly debated contributions.
Yeah. It's incredible to think about how influential his ideas became. Like, he really shifted the conversation about the role of the individual, the market, the government.
He did. But of course, not everyone was on board with Smith's vision of, like, free markets and limited government.
Right.
And this is where we start to see other schools of thought emerging, offering these alternative visions of how society should be organized.
Okay, so, like, who are some of these dissenting voices, these people who are, like, challenging the status quo? I'm guessing Karl Marx makes an appearance soon.
You read our minds.
Yeah.
But before we get to Marx, let's talk about this fascinating group of thinkers known as the utopian socialists.
Okay.
Folks like Robert Owen, Charles Fourier, Henri de Saint-Simon.
These thinkers were deeply concerned about the social inequalities they saw arising from, like industrial capitalism. They believed in cooperation over competition, advocated for these more equitable societies.
So they were, like, troubled by the downsides of unfettered capitalism.
It's interesting how they represent, like, this early pushback against some of the negative consequences that we see, like sometimes with free markets.
Absolutely. And unlike some later socialist thinkers, the utopians, they weren't interested in, like, violent revolution.
Right.
They believed in creating model communities, these little pockets of social harmony, to demonstrate that a better world was possible.
It's like they were trying to build these mini utopias, right?
These, like, examples of what a more just and equitable society could actually look like in practice.
Exactly.
So tell us more about, like, some of their ideas.
Well, Robert Owen, for example.
All right.
He was actually a successful factory owner
Oh, wow.
and kind of a radical thinker for his time. He really believed in improving working conditions for his employees. He provided education for their children. He ensured decent housing. And he even established this model community in New Lanark, Scotland, based on these principles.
Wow. So he was, like, really putting these ideas into practice. It's one thing to, like, theorize about a better world, but to actually try to build it.
Right.
That's pretty impressive.
It was a build experiment. And you know what? It worked. New Lanark became this incredibly successful community. People came from all over Europe to see Owen's ideas in action.
Okay, so we've got the physiocrats advocating for the importance of land, limited government.
We've got Adam Smith championing the power of the invisible hand.
We have the utopian socialists
Right.
pushing for more equitable societies. And now it's time to bring in Karl Marx.
I can only imagine this is where the debate really heats up.
So the utopian socialists are advocating for like a kinder, gentler capitalism.
But then Karl Marx enters the picture.
And I'm sensing he's not going to be as gentle.
Where does he fit into all of this?
Marx, he's a game changer. There's no doubt about it. He looked at the inequalities arising from industrial capitalism.
And he didn't just see flaws to be tweaked. He saw, like, fundamental contradictions within the system itself.
Okay.
Remember how Adam Smith, he believed in the invisible hand?
Guiding self-interest toward collective good.
Right, the baker making bread.
Unintentionally benefiting society.
Exactly. Well, Marx saw a different kind of invisible hand at work.
One that drove exploitation and created a system that was inherently unstable.
Okay.
He argued that capitalism, by its very nature, was prone to crises.
And would eventually be overthrown by the working class.
So instead of a harmonious system, Marx saw a ticking time bomb.
Exactly. He believed that the relationship between capitalists, those who own the means of production, and the workers was inherently unequal, and it would inevitably lead to conflict. He saw history as this struggle between different classes with economics right at the heart of it.
It's wild how those ideas resonated so powerfully, right?
Like, they sparked revolutions, shaped political movements.
Well, they did. Marx's ideas had an undeniable impact, shaping the course of the 20th century, really.
But, back to our journey through economic thought. The story doesn't end with Marx's critique. The field of economics kept evolving, grappling with new challenges, developing new schools of thought.
Right, because if there's one constant in history, it's that things change.
So what happens next in the world of economics?
Well, as we move into the 20th century, we see the rise of neoclassical economics,
Okay.
which focuses on things like marginal utility, rational choice, mathematical models. This approach really tries to make economics more scientific, more rigorous.
So more equations, less philosophy.
In a way, yeah. It's about understanding individual economic behavior and how markets reach equilibrium, that point where supply and demand balance out. Think of it this way. How much are you willing to pay for a cup of coffee?
Ooh, a lot. Actually, I'm kind of addicted.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But that willingness to pay, it probably decreases with each additional cup you have, right?
That's the idea of marginal utility. The satisfaction from each additional unit of something decreases.
Right.
And neoclassical economics tries to model those kinds of choices.
Okay, I see the logic there.
But did this new approach, did it have any blind spots?
It did. The early 20th century threw a few curveballs that neoclassical economics wasn't quite ready for, like the Great Depression.
Right, a real-world reality check.
Exactly. Suddenly, those assumptions of rational individuals acting in their self-interest, well, they weren't holding up so well in the face of mass unemployment and economic collapse.
Right.
So how did economics adapt to this new, kind of more chaotic landscape?
That's where John Maynard Keynes enters the picture.
Okay.
He argued that the government had a crucial role to play in managing the economy, especially during times of crisis.
So much for laissez-faire.
Right. Keynes argued that the government could stimulate demand by increasing spending, even if it meant running a deficit. This would put people back to work, get the economy moving again. His ideas were hugely influential and really helped to shape the policies that got us out of the Great Depression.
Keynes, the interventionist.
And his ideas are still debated today, right?
Especially when governments are dealing with recessions, economic downturns.
Oh, absolutely. The role of government in the economy is an ongoing debate.
Now, the story of 20th century economics doesn't end there. We see new challenges emerge, things like globalization, inequality, environmental degradation, and the field continues to evolve. Behavioral economics challenges those assumptions of perfect rationality.
All right.
Development economics searches for solutions to global poverty. It's an ongoing conversation.
It really is. Wow, so we've gone from, like, managing households in ancient Greece
Yes,
to...
tackling these global challenges. Quite a journey. What a deep dive.
Yeah.
What would you say is like the key takeaway from all of this?
For me, the biggest takeaway is that economics, it isn't this static, fixed body of knowledge.
It's a constantly evolving conversation, a struggle to understand how we create and distribute and value resources in a world where there's not always enough to go around.
It's a world of scarcity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's a conversation that's been going on for centuries. And it's one that we're all a part of, whether we realize it or not.
That's such a good point. And I don't know about you, but I'm feeling, like, a little bit more informed, maybe even a little bit empowered to engage in these conversations in a different way now.
I love that. That's what we were hoping for.
You know, economics isn't just for experts, it's not just for academics, it's for all of us. The more we understand these concepts, the better equipped we are to make informed decisions, participate in these crucial conversations, and ultimately to shape the future of our world.
What a fantastic note to end on. A huge thank you to our expert for taking us on this incredible deep dive into the history of economic thought.
It's been amazing. And to our listeners, keep those thinking caps on. We'll catch you next time for another fascinating deep dive.